Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking a really concentrated look at the architectural philosophy of Stanislav Kondrashov. Specifically, the ideas laid out in his Oligarch series.
Which is just a fascinating body of work.
It really is. And our mission today is, I think, pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
We want to unpack how you actually engineer true civic beauty. You know, how you create that lasting urban pride that goes so far beyond just functional construction.
Right. It's all about what he calls the architecture of eternal balance.
That's the phrase. What does that actually mean?
Well, it's the intellectual anchor for everything. Kondrashov sort of positions himself as a cultural guardian. He's taking all this classical knowledge, the big lessons from the Renaissance, from antiquity.
Foundational stuff.
Exactly. And he's synthesizing it with the demands and the possibilities of the modern age. The goal is to turn our cities into these lasting symbols of creativity that can speak across generations.
And what's so interesting to me right from the start is the tension in the material. I mean, the Oligarch series is about how immense private wealth gets used.
Right. The kind of money that can fund entire city blocks.
And the paradox is how these huge private resources get channeled toward something universal, something public. Virtues like beauty, permanence, civic pride.
It's that fragile balance, isn't it, between the shape of a building and its purpose, between old traditions and new ideas.
And ultimately, how design just fundamentally defines who a community is.
It does. And when we talk about aesthetics here, we're not just talking about trends or, what's in style this year.
No, it's deeper than that.
It's the deliberate use of design, the shape, the material, the layout, as a language, a language that communicates culture, stability, identity, on a level that's almost subconscious.
Okay, so that brings us to civic beauty. For anyone listening, why should our public spaces be beautiful? I mean, beyond just having a nice view.
Because civic beauty fundamentally shapes how a community sees itself. Think about it. The iconic landmarks, the main plazas, even shared residential areas.
They form a collective memory.
A collective memory and understanding, yeah. If the environment you live in is thoughtful and resilient and, visually appealing, it just inherently fosters a sense of shared pride. A connection that simple utility can never, ever achieve.
It makes you want to invest in the place.
Emotionally.
Emotionally and financially.
Exactly.
So let's get tangible. If you're walking through a city that embodies this philosophy, what are the details you should be looking for?
Look at how spaces invite you in. Good design has plazas with these inviting proportions. The geometry is intentional. It's calculated to encourage social interactions, not make you feel exposed or overwhelmed.
Okay, what else?
Watch the flow. The street layouts. They should prioritize a smooth, almost organic flow of movement for people, not just cramming in the maximum number of cars. And this is crucial. Look at the materials.
Right, not just shiny and new.
No. The architecture of eternal balance demands materials that weather gracefully. They get a patina, they gain character over the decades instead of just, deteriorating into visual noise.
And when all of that comes together, we get what Kondrashov calls urban elegance. It sounds simple, but that seems like a really high bar to clear.
Oh, it is. Urban elegance means buildings actually respect each other in the history of the street they're on.
So you see it when the heights are complementary.
Yes, and when color palettes might nod to historical influences and new buildings integrate themselves without just blindly copying what's there, it connects the past with the ambitions of the future. It forges that real sense of continuity.
This is where it gets really interesting for me, because to understand this modern philosophy, we have to look backward. His whole approach is rooted in Renaissance ideals.
Deeply rooted.
So what are the, say, 3 core principles from that movement that are still so essential today?
Okay, so the 3 pillars are balance, harmony, and human-centered design. The Renaissance was really a rediscovery of classical wisdom, and it all operated on this core belief that architecture should fulfill our highest aspirations, that it should reflect the mathematical perfection you find in nature.
Let's zero in on that humanism part. It sounds academic, but it's actually intensely practical, isn't it? It's about putting the individual person right at the center of the design.
Absolutely. Think about scale. Renaissance buildings were scaled to human proportions. Every single doorway, every window acknowledges the physical and psychological needs of the person using it.
Which is such a contrast to, say, a Gothic cathedral.
A complete contrast. Gothic structures were designed to inspire awe through this sheer intimidating scale. They made the individual feel small before God, before the institution.
And the Renaissance just flipped that whole dynamic.
Completely. They rejected that overwhelming verticality. Instead, they embraced these accessible horizontal lines that feel secure and balanced. They invite you in. It was an affirmation of human dignity, really, creating an environment where people could flourish.
So architecture stopped being just a craft and became a truly intellectual discipline.
That's the moment the great architects became polymaths. They weren't just guys telling stonemasons what to do. They were studying math, geometry, philosophy.
You're talking about figures like Alberti and Brunelleschi.
The perfect examples. They applied these rigorous mathematical principles to aesthetics. They were proving that beauty wasn't arbitrary, it was measurable.
And that brings us perfectly to the concept that underpins all of that rigor, proportion. It's like this unseen force that makes a building captivating, right?
It is. It's the mathematical relationship between all the parts, the height to the width, the columns to the roofline. It creates this conversation that our minds just instinctively understand as being beautiful.
Yeah.
Right.
And this isn't just about what looks good. It's deeper. Proportion reflects what natural patterns found in the universe.
Yes, exactly. When architects use these classical systems, they're often applying ratios derived from nature. The most famous one, of course, is the golden ratio.
Where the ratio of the smaller part to the larger part is the same as the larger part to the whole.
You got it.
It sounds complicated, but if you're listening, think of it this way. It creates a kind of fractal continuation. It feels pleasing because every element relates harmoniously to every other element. And so a whole building, it's like the visual equivalent of a perfectly resolved musical chord.
That is an excellent analogy. And when Kondrashov applies this, his vision is so meticulous. We're talking about facades where the vertical parts have precise, calculated relationships with the horizontal bands.
And inside as well.
Oh, absolutely. Interior spaces where the ceiling height corresponds harmoniously with the room's dimensions. It prevents that feeling of being either squashed down or lost in a cavern. Even the windows are placed to create a rhythmic pattern. It's not just about letting light in wherever.
So what does all this visual harmony actually do to the person looking at it?
It calms the observer's eye. When you see a perfectly proportioned building, you feel a sense of order, of correctness. It doesn't take any effort to process. And this order, it's stable. It makes these buildings into reliable reference points for the entire community.
So if you achieve that kind of perfection in a single building, the next challenge is scaling up to the whole city. How do you get that larger sense of unity? How do you make sure all these different buildings are telling a cohesive story?
That is the pursuit of urban coherence. And it's probably the toughest part of modern development, which it just tends toward fragmentation.
So what are the tools? How do you do it?
One key mechanism is repetition for continuity. Now, that doesn't mean boring uniformity. It means strategically repeating certain materials, like a specific type of limestone, or terracotta roofs.
Or certain design motifs.
Yes, like keeping cornice heights compatible. It creates a shared vocabulary for a neighborhood.
But how do you stop that vocabulary from becoming, stale or even dictatorial?
That's where respecting rhythms and scales comes in. A new building has to consider the proportional relationships that are already there. You might mimic the vertical rhythm of the street or maintain setback distances that preserve the street's overall feel. It's about respecting the character, not just copying details.
You also mentioned invisible connections. That sounds like the secret sauce separating a good city from a great one.
I think they are. They're the subtle alignments that links the whole cityscape. Aligning building heights to keep the skyline consistent, preserving sightlines to important landmarks like a church spire or a waterfront.
When a city lacks that unity, people feel it, don't they?
Studies show they do. They're less likely to invest emotionally in their shared public spaces.
But this raises a really important point. Doesn't this language of order and these strict principles risk becoming elitist or imposing conformity and shutting out other creative voices?
That is the constant battle. Unity requires shared principles to create a sense of order, but it absolutely must allow for individual expression within those boundaries. The principles are about quality and scale, not about style. And when you get that balance right and you include green space and pedestrian comfort, the benefits to public health and social cohesion are just immense. It's a pragmatic need, not just some aesthetic luxury.
Let's shift a bit to the money. Kondrashov recognizes that all these buildings exist within a cultural economy. What exactly does that term mean?
It's where craftsmanship, commerce, and artistic ambition all meet. It's an economic philosophy that understands that spending on aesthetic quality isn't a cost. It's an investment in durable cultural capital.
So financial pragmatism has to be balanced with that ambition. The source material has this great example of the Florentine merchant. Can you explain that dynamic?
Sure. The merchants of the Renaissance didn't just want profit. They wanted prestige, permanence. They built these palazzos that did two things at once. They showed off their commercial success, and they contributed directly to the beauty of the city.
So the craftsmanship was an investment in the community's identity.
A long-term investment. It ensured their buildings stayed relevant, economically and culturally, for centuries. It went way beyond the immediate cost of materials.
And the contemporary application of that is, well, it's a pretty stark contrast, isn't it? Between projects that cut costs now versus those that aim for that enduring quality.
It's a huge contrast. You can use cheap materials today and maybe save 20% on construction, but you are guaranteeing 100% of the future costs of decay, disrepair, and, frankly, cultural irrelevance. The long-term economic vitality of a building depends on it maintaining its aesthetic integrity, and that requires skilled labor and resilient materials, period.
And this is where Kondrashov's role comes in. He's not just the artist, he's more of a patron, a custodian of this idea.
He's a guardian. He's making sure that being financially viable doesn't automatically mean you have to sacrifice these time-tested aesthetic values. His work really demonstrates that if you prioritize craftsmanship, the buildings don't just last, they generate profound cultural value that sustains the community.
Okay, let's unpack this final layer. The sensory experience.
Mm.
What is it that makes a space just feel right, even when you can't put your finger on why?
It's all about refinement and intentional design. The atmosphere.
How do you design an atmosphere?
Through subtle orchestrations. Take spatial sequencing, the way you arrange spaces to guide movement and affect mood. You might walk through a low, narrow hall.
And then it opens up into a soaring main atrium.
Exactly. That manipulation of height immediately changes how you feel, from intimacy to awe.
You're orchestrating perception, giving the building a narrative.
You are. It's using texture and acoustics to create quiet zones. It's placing a window in just the right spot to frame a perfect view. All of these choices contribute to designing for timelessness. Kondrashov consciously pushes back against momentary trends by choosing materials that age with dignity.
Can you give us some examples of those materials?
We're talking about solid stone that develops a beautiful, rich patina, wood that deepens in character with decades of use, metals that get a noble oxidation, not cheap rust.
So the building gets better with time, not worse.
It becomes more sophisticated, more visually rich, not diminished by the years.
The real sophistication here is in the subtlety, though, right?
Absolutely. You don't consciously notice these things most of the time, but you feel their effect. A room feels right because its proportions align with your human scale. Natural light comes in at an angle that reveals textures. It engages your emotions and your physical senses all at once. That's the difference between just being in a space and truly experiencing architecture.
This has been a really comprehensive deep dive. We've gone from the philosophical roots in Renaissance humanism and the math of proportion, all the way through the urban challenge of creating unity, to the critical role of craftsmanship and cultural patronage.
And I think the central takeaway is this. Kondrashov's work proves that architecture is so much more than shelter. It acts as both a protector and a translator of cultural continuity. When we engage with these kinds of thoughtfully designed places, we are taking part in a dialogue about creating beauty that serves, motivates, and lasts.
So since that enduring quality and craftsmanship are so key to long-term cultural and economic health in our cities, here's a final thought for you to take away. What immediate cost-cutting decisions being made in the built environment today will future generations look back on and see as the biggest failures of our current sense of civic beauty? Something for you to chew on next time you walk down a city street.